This next section will talk about the suicide and self-harm protocol. A suicide or self-harm protocol is necessary when doing pearls. Why? Because depression is a risk factor for both suicidal thoughts as well as suicidal attempts. Your agency may already have a procedure in place, and if not, it's important to develop one before you start doing the Pearls program. All staff, especially your Pearls coach and supervisor, need to know what to do if somebody is suicidal over the course of Pearls. In the protocol, you can identify resources both within your agency as well as outside. And this module is intended to provide a brief overview, but is not an exhaustive training. We'll provide some resources at the end of this module, and we'll include other resources as we get them on our website. So what are some of the key elements in a written suicide and self-harm protocol? First, it's important to include what would trigger the protocol to be carried out. Often, this includes a person answering yes to question 9 on the PHQ-9, which asks about how often they've been bothered by thoughts of death or thoughts of self-harm. A yes answer is if they answer a 1, 2, or 3 on this question, meaning that some days, more than half the days, or nearly every day in the last 2 weeks, have they felt that they've had thoughts of death and thoughts of self-harm. You might also trigger your written protocol if somebody expresses having a current suicidal plan or intent or a recent suicide attempt over the course of your Pearls sessions. Next, the written protocol has guidelines on an assessment, what the Pearls counselor or coach needs to know how to do an initial suicide assessment with the participant in that moment. The real goal of that assessment is to differentiate between whether the person has suicidal ideation or thought, intent, or action, and this will help determine their level of risk. We often get asked how often this will come up over the course of during Pearls. In our experience of doing the program and talking with others around the country, we've found it's very rare that someone is actively suicidal over the course of the program. That said, it's important to have a protocol in place in case they are to best support both your team and the participant. We do see that about 10 to 20% of older adults may endorse having suicidal thoughts over the course of Pearls, and that's why it's important to prepare your team accordingly. This next table shows different ways to assess risk and some of the questions you might ask over the course of that assessment. The lowest level of risk is when a participant has thoughts of death only or self-harm, and this is known as suicidal ideation. This means they don't have a plan in place and they haven't exhibited any suicidal behaviors, such as having a previous suicide attempt. It's important, though, to ask specific questions to gauge their level of risk and whether they're only having suicidal thoughts or additional risk. So you may ask, gosh, with this much stress, have you thought of ever hurting yourself or harming yourself? Or have you ever tried to kill yourself? It's important to get specific in your assessment and to practice doing this with your team so that you can ask these questions to assess someone's level of risk. Often, when older adults express having suicidal thoughts, they may be having a more global or general thought of preferring that they would not wake up the next morning. But when you ask specific questions, they would not be at risk for harming themselves because of their faith or other beliefs against suicide. That said, some of your clients may be at higher risk. In the middle bar, you can see that some clients may, in addition to having thoughts of suicide or self-harm, have limited intent. So while they may not have a plan in place, they may have had a previous suicide attempt. These clients are at higher risk, and for them, it's important to assess for how often, for how long, and the intensity of these suicidal thoughts to gauge their intent and how much risk they're at. Lastly, when somebody has thoughts of suicide that are more definite and a plan in place, the means to implement the plan, and have engaged in preparatory or rehearsal behavior, This is when they're at their highest risk. In this case, it's important to gather information from them of what their plan is, how, when, and where they plan to execute that plan, whether they have the means available to them at that time or plan on getting them, such as medications by their nightstand or a weapon, and what their timeline is for carrying out that plan. All this information will be really essential to share with your clinical supervisor in the next step of the protocol. These are your action steps as a PEARLS coach. You'll consult with your clinical supervisor, and as consistent with agency procedures, you'll develop a safety plan with the client. You'll check whether they've informed other providers they work with, such as their primary care provider, another mental health provider, or home health provider about any of these suicidal thoughts, intent, or action. If not, you'll want to request permission to release this information to their other care providers. Then provide emergency numbers for your area, and this is what you'll want to customize in your protocol in different parts of the country, as there are numbers that are both local as well as for different states and nationally. It's important you take more definite steps if warranted, such as taking the client to the emergency room or calling the police if you're concerned about their imminent risk. And you'll document all these activities and steps taken in the client's record. A sample suicide and self-harm plan is provided in the PEARLS toolkit. This document's also provided as a Word file, so you can edit it as needed to align with your other organization procedures and how you support your clients. Here's some other resources you might access, both for additional training, protocols, as well as hotlines that you might access to support both your PEARLS coaches and your older adults to help prevent suicide over the course of PEARLS and beyond for your other programs you offer at your organization. It's important you practice this once you've established your protocol with your team, and then your clinical supervisor is there to support you over the course of your PEARLS work.